And even back then, it was wrong to say it in certain ways, and the people were cursed, and that their skin color had anything to do with it, which it did not. And so, just to be clear, anyone in the church who is or was racist, and they tried to use the scriptures and said nasty things, and shame on them.
And as a preface to this topic, we're going to look briefly at the Huffington Post, just to get an outsider's view of how people in the media have characterized this topic.
This ban was lifted in 1978, but aside from telling the public that it was time for a change, reasoning for the lift remained unclear. And so now they are trying to clear things up with a 2,000-word statement that was posted on the church's website. So what's going on, Paul? I mean, why do you think that they decided to do this now? And what did the statement say?
Well, the statement said we were completely wrong. And that, that there was a context for it, which was this racially divided country into which Mormonism is a homegrown religion. It's from the United States. The United States was a deeply racially divided, racist country. And I think in some ways that's part of the legacy of the Mormon Church. What's good about this is that they have finally come out and said, this is why we did it, because we were part of this racist legacy. I mean, they didn't use that language, but I did read the document, and it's very clear. They're saying we know now that that was wrong. We know that there's dark people's skin does not indicate any sort of spiritual inferiority, which they used to say. Black people can be priests. What is amazing is how many Black Mormons there are. And I think what is important about this document is that it allows those people to say, okay, there has been a complete, now we can go forward and say, okay, it's clear. We're not, what happened in the past, we're admitting it, and now we can move forward.
Yeah, well, certainly better late than never, right?
I should say, and I should just add, that there's not a religion in America that doesn't have a racist past.
Everything you just heard from the Huffington Post, I'd recommend you pretty much just scrub any impression that you may have taken away from that.
It's called a neuralizer. It's a gift from some friends from out of town. This red eye here will isolate the electronic impulses in your brains, and more specifically the ones for memory.
What in the hell is going on?
Excellent question. And the answer you're looking for lies right here. I am just a figment of your imagination.
Instead, let's look more closely at what the church did admit was wrong and what it didn't say, because there's a lot of insinuations and blatant inaccuracies in what this gentleman just said. So let's break this down. So here we can see what the church admitted was wrong, and a couple of items they didn't even address, which is going to be the key focus of this presentation. So what the church said was wrong was that black skin is a sign of divine disfavor or curse, that it reflects unrighteous actions in a premortal life, that mixed race marriages are a sin, that blacks or people of any other race or ethnicity are inferior, that the curse of Cain and Canaan had any link to being destined for slavery. So we can confidently say that those were just opinions. And as this policy lasted for 150 years, you're going to have a lot of publications that are going to echo similar sentiments, but that doesn't necessarily make them pervasive or doctrine or anything that we should have to respect today. So what the essay did not say was that a restriction on Canaanites and their descendants from the priesthood was wrong. So we can discard all the other things that had been said over time, but we're going to focus on this today.
The church doesn't come out and say the restriction was wrong or that it was racist. So that's an important distinction to make, because even though Huffington Post is spelling out that the church said certain things were wrong, they're also lumping in the whole policy, the whole restriction, without giving the explanation I'm about to give. The hard part navigating this topic is what was scriptural, what was doctrine, what was from God, what was revealed as a revelation, and what was just man-made. So this image you see here is a statue of Brigham Young that's been tagged during a Black Lives Matter protest, and it says racist. And this just demonstrates that this topic is still relevant as of the recent protests. But there's a group of African American students, and they're not just at BYU. They look like they're maybe a national organization called Black Menaces, like Dennis the Menace. What they do is they go around and ask questions, you would think just about like Black history, but
What is revealed is what looks like a group who's just serving a far left agenda.
Okay, should sexual orientation be taught?
How often do you personally think about race?
Okay, so the question is, do you have any friends who are queer?
What's your favorite thing about
I'm here with the Black Menaces at Equality Utah's portion of the Pride Parade.
Do you think being gay is a choice or that somebody's born that way?
Okay, what's one thing you're doing to root out racism?
so I'd add my own audio here, just because I was scrolling too fast. I didn't quite get the question, but just read the text. It's kind of ridiculous what they stand for.
Okay, cool. So the question is, do you support Blue Lives Matter?
No.
No?
Sorry to the people that are mad by that.
I'm not.
No.
A trans woman a woman is, a trans man a man.
Honestly, I have no way of answering that.
Question is, do you think the Black people deserve reparations?
To the controversies surrounding Brigham Young, the person, should the name of Brigham Young University be changed?
Okay, the question is, do y'all support critical race theory?
No, I do not.
What about you?
Yes, I do.
And so as you can see from these headlines, they're gaining local and national attention as a group, and not to be taken lightly. Certainly something we'd want to, engage with and demonstrate our point of view as believers. And you can even buy some of their merchandise and go to their website. Or if you don't want to see BYU students wearing that merchandise, they can wear this merchandise. Latter-day Times and Be a Disciple t-shirts. If you'd like to inquire about getting some of those, just get in touch with me. I'll leave some information at the end of the video or at the bottom of the description.
But as a church, if we really want to root out racism, we need to go to our scriptures and acknowledge that just because there was a restriction doesn't mean anybody should have looked at someone of another race and looked down on them. Because that's not what we read in the scriptures. There's no allowance for that. And even back then, it was wrong to say it in certain ways, and the people were cursed, and that their skin color had anything to do with it, which it did not. And so, just to be clear, anyone in the church who is or was racist, and they tried to use the scriptures, and said nasty things, and shame on them. And we'll try to dive deeper into some of these quotes that church leaders have said, and explore more how the priesthood restriction was both from God, and it wasn't racist. It was not a racial policy. And I say it wasn't a racial policy because by the definition of racism, meaning someone's physical appearance or characteristics, meaning they're inferior as being like the motivation, but none of that in the scriptures or anywhere. That's not the kind of language that's used. All it says is that the descendants of Canaan didn't have right to the priesthood. Those descendants could have ended up being purple or green or orange or yellow or whatever, and that's a misnomer too, because human skin tone is, if you look at the definition from the Smithsonian Museum, we're all just shades of brown. There's no such thing as a white person or a black person. Brigham Young even said this. I'll post a couple of links here that you can read. Read those. Brigham Young basically said he's not a white person. I don't. My whiteness is not something I think about. Call that white privilege or whatever, but
this is a classic example of white privilege, and you both have it.
What's that?
So white privilege is when white people, particularly men, automatically assume they can take whatever they want. And they never have to worry about getting stopped by the police.
Step aside, please. We have white privilege.
Don't worry, it's okay. We automatically assume we can take what we want, and we don't have to worry about the police.
That's white privilege.
Whoa. And we have that?
Well, I'm glad we've been able to enlighten you. The real question is, do you think you'll be acting differently from now on?
I guarantee it.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
What should we take next? Sir, maybe you didn't know, but we have white privilege.
Get your hands where I can see them!
I think the problem is you're just uneducated.
Yeah, we're gonna get jobs on Wall Street.
I'm European, of all kinds. And yeah, our descendants lived in the north, and, according to science, they ate a certain diet and they were exposed to the sun a certain amount. And likewise, what we call blacks, or those who lived in sub-Saharan Africa, they had a certain diet, they were exposed to a certain amount of the sun, and for centuries and centuries, and our people stayed separate and isolated, and we became who we are today. And it's a social construct to say, I'm white and you're black, or those are made up terms. They don't go with science. They don't go with the scriptures. And we could talk about how, well, the scriptures and the Pearl of Great Price, they talk about blackness, and Book of Mormon talks about a skin of blackness, but it doesn't. Black has a different meaning in the English language, that and the writers of those scriptures were Hebrew. They had a Hebrew background. Nephi, Abraham. These were not Nordic white supremacists. So when they say that a blackness came upon these people, or God cursed the Lamanites and caused a skin of blackness, well, there's other meanings to the words that are used in the scriptures. It's not, you can't just assume they're talking about black is the way we know it, or just assume that white means a white person, or white supremacy, or black and dark, and even skins. Like, what is that? We're talking about ancient people. Like, maybe we're talking about their clothing. And that's exactly what's going on. And you can read about how I talk about the skin of blackness in the Book of Mormon and what that actually means. It doesn't mean that the Lamanites were black or dark brown or whatever. It just means that they, literally, that they weren't wearing white temple covenant clothing. If you read the language about temples, about covenants, about garments, about these things becoming, then Lamanites can become white, and they're talking about, because the curse isn't the skin or even their garments or whatever. The curse is like that they rebel against God. Well, the Lamanites, they believed in the law of Moses. They had their own religion. But unlike the Nephites, they weren't wearing the white sort of symbolic true covenant white skins. And some people might try to dispute that, but I'd really like to see the very limited amount of time that the Book of Mormon actually spends talking about skins. It's pretty obvious from all the surrounding verses that they're talking about the temple, the covenant, the garment. It should say the Lamanites were given garments of black. They wore. It's kind of like when Cain, when he gave the wrong sacrifice, and Abel gave the right sacrifice. Well, the same thing is going on with the Nephites and the Lamanites. The Lamanite curse was, again, they were separated from God. They didn't have the priesthood. They had their own religion, left to their own devices. God wasn't giving them revelation. They were cut off from God. That is literally the definition of a curse in the scriptures, to be separated from God. And there's all kinds of curses. We're all cursed. The earth is cursed. Adam was cursed. The people at the Tower of Babel were cursed. The Canaanites were cursed. And it just so happens that, and the Canaanites were more than just African Americans who were, brought into slavery here and who suffered through Jim Crow, which was the true atrocities. The withholding of the priesthood is sort of coincidental. If you think about it, with Joseph Smith, when he revealed this theology, which he didn't fully realize, or and he could have, he did talk about sending missionaries to the South and trying to correct, his theology. If it was more worked out, if he had not been assassinated for running for president, on an abolition platform, eventually he probably could have got this message out more fully. That the way slavery was happening was wrong, and he could have used Paul, and he could have used persuasion. Well, that was one of the methods of abolition. Besides people like John Brown, who absolutely hated slavery, rightfully so. But he got himself and a bunch of others killed, and there's a whole bunch of methods. And of course, it all ended with Abraham Lincoln sending troops down into the South and a bloody civil war, and something probably Brigham Young would have never imagined.
That document makes you a citizen. This one makes you a private in the Union Army. Now go fight for your country. Next.
And we got the Yankee man, he shoved a gun into our hand, saying, Paddy, you must go and fight for Lincoln.
And then it came. The first day of the draft.
Thomas O'Neill, Andrew Lewis, Joseph Flynn.
They read out the draftees' names like they was dead already.
W.H. Myers. Ahead with the draft! Get the pen fire, boys! Rip them apart! Terrorist bastard!
As seen in the film Gangs of New York here, you can just sort of get a quick glimpse of the reaction to the draft and to immigrants. As soon as they came to America, they were given a gun and sent to the front lines. And you can imagine, from a Christian point of view, from a prophet like Brigham Young, who succeeded Joseph Smith, who believed that in a form of abolition, but much different than drafting free people into this fight to their certain death. And God bless all those who went and died, and slavery was finally ended. And but you have to take the comments of someone like Brigham Young and put them in the context of pre-abolition, and the fact that slavery was a reality, sadly, and there was no end in sight, really, without full-scale war and a draft, something that was not very popular and had a lot of negative reaction. And so I think maybe we need to back off on the presentism a little bit and be so critical of someone like Brigham Young, who was only speaking with limited understanding and knowledge. So Brigham Young must have foresaw slavery, never ending in his lifetime or much later. And so you find these uncomfortable comments about the descendants of Canaan being destined for slavery. And it sounds a lot like Jim Crow, and it sounds like a lot like other racists who would use that exact sort of thinking to justify slavery. But then there's other comments where Brigham Young is disgusted by the slavery that he either witnesses secondhand. I don't know that he's ever visited the South. I'd have to look into that. But he made some pretty blatant comments that Southerners were abusing the slaves, and that they would be cursed or condemned for that. And this all stems from Genesis, the book of Genesis, where Noah curses his son Ham, or rather his son Canaan, right? So Noah's grandson Canaan. And let's take a look from the film Noah, and this is going to demonstrate unknowingly to the makers of the film that this demonstrates something that, I say unknowingly, but they're not members of the church. And it's just really interesting what they put together here. And so let's take a look at this.
Let me tell you a story. The first story my father told me, and the first story that I told each of you. In the beginning, there was nothing. Nothing but the silence of an infinite darkness. But the breath of the Creator fluttered against the face of the void, whispering, "Let there be light." And light was. And it was good. The first day. And then the formless light began to take on substance and shape. The second day. And the Creator made man, and by his side woman, father and mother of us all. He gave them a choice. To the blessing of light.
Aronofsky's co-screenwriter, Ari Handel, he explains the snakeskin in the scene from the Noah film. When Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, it says God gave them a garment of skin, sort of a parting gift from God to mankind as we leave Eden and go out into the world. So we wondered what that was. And as we looked at commentaries about it, one of the common ones was that it was the skin of a snake. We wondered why that would be, and it occurred to us that God made the snake. The snake was good at first, but then the tempter arose through it. In our version, we have the snake shed that skin, and the shed skin is the shell of original goodness that the snake left behind when it became the tempter. It's a symbol of the Eden that we left behind. It's a garment to clothe you spiritually. We see here in the Noah film, the prophet is utterly wasted, struggling no doubt with survivor's guilt. And it's going to cut to a scene where his son Ham is looking out, pondering all the events that have taken place. And you see him reflect and look down upon the snakeskin as he holds that and then proceeds to look for his father. And he sees him lying naked, and his brothers come along and they cover themselves or turn their backs and cover their father. And this is the origin of the curse of Ham, or rather the curse of Canaan, Ham's son, who Ham had a wife, but in this film they chose to leave the wife out for whatever reason, and the creators of the movie explain why they chose to do that. But you'll see Ham, after disappointing his father, he tosses onto the beach the snakeskin. And after learning what that means from the creators of the film, it really ties well into what we're talking about here.
He's here.
Instead of a literal interpretation of the curse of Canaan and the servant's meaning, some sort of prophecy of them becoming slaves, which I don't believe is what it is what is the word servant? Where do we hear that a lot? We hear the word servant associated with prophets, and prophets have the priesthood. So if prophets are the servant of the Lord, well, what would a servant of servants be? That could mean just a designation lower, being someone who doesn't have the priesthood, right? Servant of God is a prophet who has a priesthood. Servant of servants. Of course, we're dealing with English language, Hebrew translations, but I really don't feel like God and Noah were trying to condemn the descendants of Canaan to slavery. In fact, Richard Bushman, who wrote the biography of Joseph Smith, he talks about this. He says the narrative in Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham has nothing to do with inferiority or slavery, only priesthood, only a designation where they cannot receive the priesthood. And so there's a lot to think about as far as a lot of the comments that were made over the years. But the racial restriction, it wasn't a racial, it was a lineage restriction. And some people might be, oh, well, it's the same thing. Well, no, hold on, but pause for a minute. Okay. The only reason Black Lives Matter is talking about like institutional racism and all that is because of Jim Crow, right? Not the priesthood restriction. That's just lumped in there because we're also an American religion, and we're just sort of lumped in there with all the other white people, which again, we're not white. There's no white people. There's no black people. That doesn't exist.
All right. So do you think that the priesthood and temple ban was from God?
The what?
The priesthood and temple ban.
What was that?
So from about 1845 to 1978, black members of the church weren't allowed to receive the priesthood or enter the temple.
Ooh, I gotta say I don't think it is.
Yeah, I'd have to do more research on that.
Okay.
No.
Good.
Absolutely not. Are you kidding? Period. No.
Period.
No.
I don't know. That's a deep question. That's the one I'd have to think about, I think, to answer right away. No.
Okay.
No. There was definitely some personal opinion and interest in there.
Good.
Lunch counters, sitting at the back of the bus, not being able to vote or having to pass difficult exams, or all the crazy stuff in Alabama and Georgia and Texas and Louisiana for decades until the 60s. That was institutional racism, and that was definitely motivated by the fact that the white racists in power in the South, the Democrats, they defined and identified blacks, African Americans, as being inferior. Joseph Smith's priesthood restriction in the Book of Abraham says no such thing, right? And that should be where it ends. Brigham Young made a bunch of bad comments, and some others piggybacked off of that, and the church has since rejected those. They're embarrassing. We don't like them. It's okay to say that some of the prophets explain the restriction in wrong language. In this next clip, how it relates to this topic, the Black Menaces are asking some of the students about a quote from Apostle Bruce R. McConkie, and a little snippet that they literally use like 5 or 6 words of the quote. They don't even give the full quote. But from his Once Upon a Time, his popular book that he had published called Mormon Doctrine, written by himself. It was not something that the entire church presidency and apostles all signed up on, but it was published back in the 1950s. So this is old stuff.
All right, so I'm going to say a quote. The quote is, "Negroes are not equal to other races." Now, who do you think said that? Apostle Bruce R. McConkie or German leader Adolf Hitler?
I would guess German leader Adolf Hitler.
You would be incorrect. It was Apostle Bruce R. McConkie.
It's got to be Apostle because, yeah.
Final guess.
Apostle. I'm gonna guess Bruce R. McConkie.
You would be correct.
That's insane.
That's reality.
I would hope not the Apostle, but I mean, I'm gonna go with Hitler.
Unfortunately, it was not. It was Bruce R. McConkie. He's the one who said that.
Yeah.
Probably Bruce R. McConkie.
You would probably be correct. That is right. Our good old apostle.
So here's the full quote. It's really unfortunate vernacular, but the key part that they leave off here is where the receipt of certain spiritual blessings are concerned. Where the receipt of certain spiritual blessings are concerned.
You cannot accept the books written by the authorities of the church as standards of doctrine, only insofar as they accord with the revealed word in the standard works.
So at first glance, such a quote is pretty shocking to think that anyone supposing to represent Jesus Christ, let alone to be considered an apostle, would ever say anything like blacks are unequal in regards to other races. Even if he meant that, which, knowing what I know about him and the whole issue, what he should have said is that Canaanites at this time don't have equal access. I mean, this whole talk about equality, and it just all sounds like Jim Crow and everything else that was going on in the context of the country. And perhaps McConkie was just simply influenced by the vernacular of the time. But it's not our doctrine that blacks are unequal to other races or ever have been in any way. There was simply a designation on Canaanites because they were Canaanites and they had descendants. It didn't matter what their race was. It had nothing to do with their abilities, their intellect, it was simply Israel had preference from God as the bearers of the priesthood. That's all we're talking about. This has nothing to do with lunch counters or voting or being in government or working at a job or sitting in the front of the bus, the back of the bus, or any of that. These activists, they take 5 or 6 words and they just lay it out there, and this kind of stuff circulates. And as Latter-day Saints, we need to be like, well, hold on, where's that from? How many times was it said? And this video will demonstrate the fact that an apostle of the Lord can simply make mistakes and say wrong things. But at the same time, it's a good look in the mirror. It's sort of cringe-worthy material, but some church history is a little cringy, but when a progressive starts talking about it, it gets super woke and a lot of virtue signaling and a lot of presentism.
Presentism, which means judging everyone in the past by the standards of the present. It's the belief that people who lived 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago really should have known better. It's like getting mad at yourself for not knowing what you know now when you were 10. Did Columbus commit atrocities? Of course. But people back then were generally atrocious. Everybody who could afford one had a slave. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, the Arabs, British, the early Americans. The word slave comes from Slav, because so many Slavic people were enslaved, and they're as white as the Hallmark Channel. But in today's world, when truth conflicts with narrative, it's the truth that has to apologize. Being woke is like a magic moral time machine where you judge everybody against what you imagine you would have done in 1066, and you always win.
It's helpful to know our enemies. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Of course, always beware of dwelling too much on these things. But if you just understand some of their points and really understand our history and be able to articulate that in an intelligent way, which is one of the reasons I do what I do, is because I haven't always been able to do that. And I'm hoping that these podcasts and the articles and the books, I'd like to write another book, but I hope I can help somebody like myself, average members out there that are just coming across sort of this extreme content that we as a church don't really know how to address.
So if you dive into Latter-day Saint history, every so often you're going to run into statements from or about past leaders that might seem a bit eyebrow-raising. For instance, an 1892 edition of the Young Women's Journal reported that Joseph Smith believed the moon was inhabited by men and women who dressed like Quakers and had very long lifespans. Kinda weird.
You can say that again.
Since some of these ideas are attributed to leaders of our faith, sometimes I'll get messages from people wondering how to tell the difference between an authoritative teaching of the church and an opinion or personal belief of a leader. What was the setting for the statement? Who was the audience? Was it ever claimed to be a revelation from God? For example, while it seems like a no-brainer for us, in Joseph's day, many people believed the moon was inhabited, thanks to astronomers like William Herschel and the Great Moon Hoax of 1835. Also, this isn't a first-hand statement from Joseph. It's actually a late third-hand statement from a guy named Oliver B. Huntington. On the church's website, we're reminded not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine. In 2012, Elder Neil A. Anderson taught, "A few question their faith when they find a statement made by a church leader decades ago that seems incongruent with her doctrine. There is an important principle that governs the doctrine of the church. The doctrine is taught by all 15 members of the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12. It is not hidden in an obscure paragraph of one talk. True principles are taught frequently and by many. Our doctrine is not difficult to find." So is this idea about the moon taught frequently and by many, either in the past or present? No, it's not. Here's what Joseph Fielding Smith wrote on the subject. "It makes no difference what is written or what anyone has said. If what has been said is in conflict with what the Lord has revealed, we can set it aside. My words and the teachings of any other member of the church, high or low, if they do not square with the revelations, we need not accept them. You cannot accept the books written by the authorities of the church as standards of doctrine, only insofar as they accord with the revealed word in the standard Every words. Man who writes is responsible, not the church, for what he writes. If Joseph Fielding Smith writes something which is out of harmony with the revelations, then every member of the church is duty-bound to reject it." Harold B. Lee taught something similar. President M. Russell Ballard said back in 2017, "I worry sometimes that members expect too much from church leaders and teachers, expecting them to be experts in subjects well beyond their duties and responsibilities. It is important to remember that I am a general authority, but that does not make me an authority in general. My calling and life experiences allow me to respond to certain types of questions. There are other types of questions that require an expert in a specific subject matter." Brigham Young taught, "I am more afraid that this people have so much confidence in their leaders that they will not inquire for themselves of God whether they are led by him. Let every man and woman know by the whispering of the Spirit of God to themselves whether their leaders are walking in the path the Lord dictates or not." So, when you stumble across eyebrow-raising statements, run through all those housekeeping questions and then consider these factors. Consistency. Does it mesh well with Scripture? Unity. Is the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 in agreement on the issue? Frequency. Is this something being taught often in public settings? And last but not least, divinity. What does God have to say about it? When you run these statements through these filters, a lot of the confusion and controversy melt away.
Joseph Smith, identified as a prophet who has the keys to gather Israel, that Canaan still had descendants upon the earth. And the book of Abraham goes into what that means. And none of that narrative allows for slavery. It doesn't allow for separate lunch counters. It doesn't allow for talking about them as if they're inferior or intellectually or however. In fact, the book of Abraham actually speaks very highly of the descendants of Canaan. If you read it, it actually speaks highly of them. It's an issue that is partially right and partially incorrect. And what our critics like to do is they'll simply just look at it wholesale as like, see, the church used to be racist. It didn't have any more inspiration than anybody else who was perpetuating it, discrimination and all these things that you read about in Black history, mostly in the South. That's where this whole 1619 project from the New York Times, and everybody's always talking about America's a racist nation or founded as a racist nation. Well, part of the United States was racist. It's like the abolitionists in the North eventually, right? Like states, as soon as the Constitution was ratified, they started freeing their slaves. And there's the Hartford Conventions in the early 1800s, and they're talking about abolishing slavery, and you start to see the abolition movement taking off. And if you look at a map of where most people lived in the United States, it's above the Mason-Dixon line, right? Because if you go below that line, it's all plantations. So people came here, they had nowhere to go but to go west. So the majority of white people lived in the North. There's like 20 something million people in the North and like maybe 9 million in the South total at this 1860, right before the Civil War. And I'll post a map here. And a good chunk of that 9 million in the South was Black. So you're talking 4 to 6 million whites compared to the 20 something million in the North. And people have the gall to say the United States is founded as a racist nation. No, it's the northern states compromised with the South to form a union to ultimately defeat monarchy. Baby steps.
Baby steps? It means setting small, reasonable goals.
There's nothing the North could do about it. That would have never entered their mind to like, let's go down and start a war. Sure, some people in the North were benefiting from it, but to pretend like the whole nation was like okay with it is just ahistorical. It's the Constitution was, was baby steps towards freedom for everybody. But there's three areas where they like to play gotcha games with the priesthood restriction. Number one is Elijah Abel, who was a Black member. Like 2 or 3 others were ordained to the priesthood before Brigham Young implemented the restriction. The position I take on Elijah Abel and others was that as the restoration was unfolding and it was not perfectly set up from day one, it was an organic evolutionary process, that it was an oversight. And again, I take no pleasure in saying that someone's ordination to the priesthood was an oversight, but we've got to be consistent here. If we believe in the scriptures, if we believe Brigham Young is a prophet, he's obviously capable of making mistakes. And that's where people they play these gotcha games. They're like, well, Joseph Smith, under his leadership, there was a few blacks ordained, and then he was killed. But we've got to look at the history a little bit closer. There's just a few things we could look at that we can sort of resolve this. And then, in fact, like a month after Elijah Abel was ordained to the priesthood, Joseph Smith writes a letter to Oliver Cowdery saying that the curse of Canaan had not yet been removed from the descendants of Canaan. Number 2 is the second article of faith, where it talks about how men are not accountable for Adam's transgressions. And they say that to mean, well, if I'm not accountable for Adam's sins, then how could blacks be accountable for Canaan's sins? Well, it doesn't quite work that way, and we can look at and see what Joseph Smith says about that as the prophet, as the founder of the church, with a little bit of authority. He can add a little perspective to that.
While Doctrine and Covenants 121 doesn't even have the Canaanites in mind, it's talking to the saints in the 19th century, but it does reveal a principle. But the bigger question is why God would allow the Canaanite curse to last, for such a long time is another question. But Doctrine and Covenants 113 does emphasize Israel's right to the priesthood pre-1978. So we have to consider all of these scriptures.
And the third is that Lehi in the Book of Mormon and his family were descendants of Joseph, being from Ephraim and Manasseh. Lehi's descendants, not being from the other tribes like Benjamin or Reuben or Judah or some of the others, but specifically coming from Joseph's line. It's like, well, how did the Nephites have the priesthood? They came from Joseph, who married an Egyptian. And the Book of Abraham talks about how those who settled Egypt were descendants of Canaan, and so it's like, wow, that's a really good argument. But what's interesting about history, and I didn't know this until I really looked into this, was that Joseph didn't marry a Canaanite. He married someone who would have been part of a group known as the Hyksos. They were a Semitic people who eventually conquered Egypt, and so at least the upper echelons of Egypt were not Canaanite. They were Semitic. They would have been kin to the Israelites, right? And the whole Egyptian thing is kind of interesting if you look at history. And Egypt today is mostly Arab, right? So populations fluctuate and shift, and it's like, well, how did Canaanites who were living in Israel when the Israelites conquered Canaan, literally the name of the land, right? When God gave the Israelites the land after coming out of Egypt, after Moses parted the Red Sea and led them, and Joshua took them to war, and the slaughter of the Canaanites and this and that. Well, that must have not been the only group of Canaanites. Clearly, there were some in Africa. And in fact, I think it's somewhere in the Old Testament. I think it's in the Psalms or Proverbs. It talks about how Egypt is the land of Ham. Ham being the father of Canaan. And, so, according to Joseph Smith, prophet of the Restoration, he and others continued to say that the descendants of Canaan were indeed those eventually who settled sub-Saharan Africa as well, and as those who had also at one time lived in Jerusalem. Of course, that could have been a large body of people. It's like if you look at the state of Texas, there's some archaeology, you'd find Texans clear from El Paso all the way to Houston. So there's no surprise that Canaanites existed in the land of Palestine, of Judea, and also just to the south, towards sub-Saharan Africa, and eventually all the way across to the west, where they would ultimately be bought and sold by other tribes within Africa, and to those sold and those brought to the United States. If you look at the definition of racism, and if you look at what the scriptures say about Israel's right to the priesthood and the Canaanites not being able to have it until a future date, which was 1978. Now everybody has the promise of Abraham. Everyone's allowed to participate. And the thing is blacks were not cursed because they were black, and they weren't black because they were cursed. That none of that is true. So the restriction was from God, but Brigham Young was wrong, and a few others were wrong about some of the things that they said. And I'll just say that. Okay, well, maybe he hadn't quite made the connection to Abraham chapter 1, so much so that he would actually implement it himself. His letter to Oliver Cowdery to take the gospel to the South, which was where the slaves were, and some potential white converts who might accept the gospel. The whole letter explains, it sort of takes the tone of Paul in the New Testament. You know, they had slavery back in the Roman times, and he would, urge slaves not to, flee from their masters, and for their masters to treat their slaves like humans and like Christians, and not treat them like property or beasts. And Brigham Young even says these kind of things. So there's this whole history where Brigham Young is both against slavery, but he's also like, it's a divine institution. And I feel like what he's talking about there is like, there's certain cases where the Old Testament talks about servitude and slavery. And
hey everyone, my name is Alan Parr. Thank you all so much for visiting my channel. And today we are answering the controversial and many times misunderstood question, does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country. Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it. And so just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so he had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves.
I believe that's sort of the perspective he's coming from. He certainly didn't believe in the brutality of Southern slavery.
Brigham Young once said, if the government of the United States and Congress assembled had the right to pass an anti-polygamy bill, they had also the right to pass a law that slaves should not be abused as they have been. For their abuse of that race, the whites will be cursed unless they repent.
The critics don't like to share those quotes. They only share the ones where he talks about the mark. He believed in the mark of Cain, which is when Cain killed Abel, God put a mark on him, and that's not in any scripture. That's just from Brigham Young, and a few others said it in some journals or church publications, or it was just generally taught. But it's not really in the scriptures. It's rejected today. It's one of the things that the church essay does reject, that black skin is this mark, which it's not. And that just needs to be said a lot. It's a very sensitive topic. I've listened to other black members, so I don't take this lightly. I'm not trying to be insensitive. But I also don't buy into the whole Marxist reparations steal from the current generation, because the descendants of today, their generations past, were enslaved. And so therefore we should tax people either through inflation or something, just to print a bunch of money to give to people who had never been enslaved before. There's a lot of opportunity in this country today. And so I go back to my point that the restriction shows up in the Restoration in Abraham chapter 1. It shows up in the letter to Oliver Cowdery, when Joseph Smith talks about sending saints into the South to preach to the masters and to not preach to the slaves, because they don't want to cause insurrection and death and violence. And so that's just a little bit more of the history and just some of the things to be aware of when people try to play these games. And it's all very interesting to make all these connections. And I've learned a lot more about all of this than you can put in a TikTok.
And if you go to my website and you click on menu and look for topic categories, and the first one at the top is Blacks in the Priesthood, and if you go scroll through there, there's about 9 articles that cover just about anything you might want to read about this, and it's all here published free. This is not something I wanted to necessarily publish commercially, and this has all just been available for years, some of it. And I hope you can take away a fresh perspective and maybe learn yourself better how to defend the faith and stand up to misconceptions. And if you're not a member of the church, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this, and hopefully you've come away with a fuller perspective of this topic. Thank you.
I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we went to college.
Yeah, it's like now I have the skills for today's workplace.